Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern reality, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the British royal family. What started as whispered conversations in palace corridors would soon explode into a crisis so profound that even the most seasoned royal advisors found themselves speechless. King Charles III, the man who had waited 74 years to wear the crown, was about to make a decision that would forever alter the dynamics of his marriage, his reign, and his relationship with the woman he had fought decades to marry. The same Camilla who had stood by his side through the darkest chapters of his life was now at the center of a royal drama that threatened to tear apart everything they had built together. This is not just another royal scandal. This is the untold story of a king caught between duty and personal relationships, of a queen consort watching helplessly as her own family becomes the source of unprecedented palace turmoil, and of decisions made in private that would echo through the halls of power and into the hearts of a nation. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the modern monarchy, revealing the human cost of wearing a crown and the impossible choices that come with absolute power. The palace may have been left speechless, but the story demands to be told. The morning of October 15th started like any other in the grand corridors of Buckingham Palace. The staff moved with their usual precision, preparing for another day in the life of Britain's newest monarch. King Charles III sat in his private study, surrounded by the weight of centuries of royal history, reviewing the morning briefings that would shape his day. The autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that had witnessed the footsteps of generations of royalty. Charles had always been a man of routine. Even in his 70s, he maintained the disciplined schedule that had defined his life as Prince of Wales. Morning prayers, breakfast at precisely 7:30, followed by meetings with his private secretaries and government officials. Today, however, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that he couldn't quite place, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made him pause as he reviewed the day's agenda. Camilla had been unusually quiet during breakfast. She sat across from him at the small table in their private dining room, her usual warm conversation replaced by distant glances toward the window. Charles had noticed the change in her demeanor over the past few weeks, but royal life had a way of consuming one's attention, leaving little time for the deeper conversations that marriages required. The queen consort had her own schedule to maintain, her own duties that demanded attention. Since the coronation, she had thrown herself into her royal role with a dedication that surprised even Charles. The woman who had once been vilified by the press and the public had transformed herself into a respected member of the royal family, earning admiration for her work with literacy charities and her support for victims of domestic violence. But lately, something had been weighing on her mind. Charles could see it in the way she hesitated before speaking, in the careful consideration she gave to every word during their private moments together. He had learned to read these signs during their decades-long relationship, understanding that Camilla often carried burdens she was reluctant to share, especially when they involved her family. The Parker Bowles family had always been a complex element in their relationship. Tom and Laura, Camilla's children from her first marriage, had gradually accepted Charles into their lives, but the integration hadn't always been smooth. There were moments of tension, periods of adjustment, and the constant challenge of blending two very different worlds. The military precision of royal life didn't always mesh well with the more relaxed approach that had characterized Camilla's previous family dynamic. As Charles finished his morning correspondence, his private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, knocked gently on the study door. The relationship between a monarch and their private secretary was one of absolute trust, built on decades of shared confidences and mutual respect. Sir Clive had served Charles during his time as Prince of Wales and had seamlessly transitioned into his role supporting the new king. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive began, his tone carrying an unusual note of concern. "There are some matters regarding the Queen Consort's family that require your immediate attention." Charles set down his fountain pen and looked up from the papers spread across his mahogany desk. The study, with its walls lined with leather-bound books and portraits of previous monarchs, had always been his sanctuary. It was here that he made the decisions that would shape not only his reign but the future of the British monarchy. "What sort of matters?" Charles asked, though something in Sir Clive's expression suggested he might not want to hear the answer. The private secretary approached the desk, carrying a folder that seemed to weigh more than its physical content suggested. "There have been some developments involving Mr. Tom Parker Bowles and his recent business ventures." The palace has been made aware of certain activities that could potentially create complications for the crown. Charles felt his stomach tighten. Throughout his life, he had watched how the actions of family members could impact the monarchy. He had lived through his own scandals, witnessed the challenges his sons had faced, and understood better than most how personal choices could become public crises when you wore a crown. "Tell me everything," he said, gesturing for Sir Clive to take a seat in one of the leather chairs positioned across from the desk. What followed was a detailed briefing that would change the trajectory of Charles's reign and his relationship with Camilla's family forever. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's eldest son, had become involved in a series of business dealings that, while not necessarily illegal, raised serious questions about the appropriateness of his associations given his connection to the royal family. The complications began with Tom's restaurant ventures. As a food critic and cookbook author, he had leveraged his connections and expertise into several successful business partnerships. However, recent investigations had revealed that some of his investors had questionable backgrounds, including connections to individuals who had been investigated for tax evasion and money laundering. Sir Clive explained that the palace had received confidential briefings from both MI5 and the Metropolitan Police regarding these connections. While Tom himself was not suspected of any wrongdoing, his association with these individuals created a potential security risk for the royal family. More concerning was the possibility that these associations could be exploited by hostile foreign actors or criminal organizations seeking to gain influence or access to sensitive information. Charles listened in growing silence as the full scope of the situation became clear. This wasn't simply a matter of poor judgment or unfortunate associations. The security implications were serious enough that the palace's protection team had recommended immediate action to distance the royal family from any potential complications. But the business associations were only the beginning. Sir Clive's folder contained additional information about Laura Lopez, Camilla's daughter, that would prove equally challenging. Laura had always maintained a lower profile than her brother, preferring to focus on her family and her work in the art world. However, recent intelligence suggested that her gallery had become involved in transactions that raised questions about the provenance of certain artworks. The art world had always been a complex environment where legitimate business often brushed against more questionable activities. Laura's gallery had recently acquired several pieces that, according to investigators, might have been stolen or illegally exported from their countries of origin. While Laura herself had no knowledge of these issues, the gallery's involvement in these transactions created another potential scandal that could engulf the royal family. Charles found himself facing a dilemma that went to the heart of what it meant to be a constitutional monarch in the 21st century. The crown required absolute integrity, not just from the monarch themselves, but from everyone in their immediate circle. The principle of being above reproach was fundamental to the monarchy's credibility and its relationship with the British people. As Sir Clive concluded his briefing, Charles realized that he was facing a decision that would test every principle he had held throughout his long preparation for kingship. The man who had waited decades to marry Camilla, who had endured years of criticism and scandal to be with the woman he loved, now had to consider whether their family connections posed an unacceptable risk to the institution he had sworn to protect. The study fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the antique clock that had belonged to his grandmother. Charles stared out the window at the palace gardens, where tourists gathered beyond the gates, hoping for a glimpse of the royal family they admired and trusted. Those people, and millions like them throughout the Commonwealth, depended on the monarchy to represent the highest standards of public service and personal integrity. "What are the recommendations from the security services?" Charles asked finally. Sir Clive's response was measured but clear. "The recommendation, Your Majesty, is that you consider implementing immediate distance between the Crown and the Parker Bowles family business interests. This would include restrictions on their access to palace events, limitations on their use of royal connections for business purposes, and potentially a complete separation from any activities that could compromise the security or reputation of the monarchy." The words hung in the air like a sentence of exile. Charles understood the implications immediately. Such actions wouldn't just affect Tom and Laura, they would fundamentally alter his relationship with Camilla. She was a woman who had always prioritized her family, who had worked tirelessly to maintain close relationships with her children despite the challenges that came with royal life. Charles thought about the years of struggle they had endured to reach this point. The Diana years, when their relationship was a source of national scandal. The gradual acceptance by the public and the press. The careful integration of Camilla into royal life, culminating in their marriage and her eventual acceptance as queen consort. All of that progress could be undone if he was forced to choose between his duties as monarch and his loyalty to his wife's family. But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, Charles knew that his primary obligation was to the crown and to the British people. The monarchy's survival depended on maintaining the trust and respect of the nation, and that trust could be shattered by even the perception of impropriety or security breaches. "I need to speak with the queen consort," Charles said finally. "She needs to understand the full scope of what we're facing." Sir Clive nodded gravely. "Your Majesty, there is one additional matter we need to discuss. The press has begun to investigate these connections. While we have managed to contain the story for now, it's likely that details will begin to emerge within the next few weeks. We need to be prepared for that possibility." The mention of press attention added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Charles had lived through enough media storms to understand how quickly a story could spiral out of control, especially when it involved the royal family. The British press, in particular, had a talent for finding and exploiting any weakness in the royal armor. As Sir Clive departed, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts, the king found himself confronting the loneliness that comes with ultimate responsibility. Every decision he made would have consequences that extended far beyond his personal relationships. The crown that had taken him 74 years to inherit came with a weight that sometimes threatened to crush the man beneath it. Charles walked to the window and looked out at the London skyline beyond the palace walls. Somewhere out there, Camilla was attending a charity event, representing the monarchy with the grace and dignity she had worked so hard to develop. She had no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down, that the family she loved was about to become a source of crisis rather than comfort. The king's mind turned to the conversation he would need to have with his wife. How do you tell the woman you love that her children have become a threat to everything you've built together? How do you explain that duty to the crown might require sacrifices that could destroy the very foundations of your marriage? As the morning progressed toward afternoon, Charles realized that he was facing the first major crisis of his reign. Unlike the ceremonial challenges of coronations and state visits, this was a test of his character, his judgment, and his ability to balance the competing demands of love and duty that had defined his entire life. The decision he was about to make would echo through the palace corridors for years to come. It would define not just his relationship with Camilla's family, but the kind of monarch he intended to be. The man who had spent decades preparing for this role was about to discover that no amount of preparation could ease the burden of choices that had no perfect solutions. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by the portraits of monarchs who had faced their own impossible decisions, King Charles III prepared to make a choice that would leave even the palace speechless. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the palace corridors as Charles made his way toward the queen consort's private apartments. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted with the knowledge of what he was about to reveal. The red-carpeted hallway, lined with portraits of previous royal consorts, seemed to stretch endlessly before him, as if the palace itself was reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. Camilla's schedule showed that she had returned from her charity engagement an hour earlier. Charles knew her routine well enough to understand that she would be in her sitting room, reviewing correspondence from her various patronages or perhaps preparing for the evening's state dinner. The normalcy of her activities made what he was about to tell her seem even more devastating. He paused outside her door, his hand raised to knock, and found himself remembering their early days together. They had been so young when they first met, both caught up in the social whirl of London's elite circles. Even then, Camilla had been fiercely protective of her family, speaking with pride about her children and her determination to shield them from the public scrutiny that came with royal associations. The knock on the door echoed through the corridor like a death knell. "Come in." Camilla's voice carried its usual warmth, though Charles could detect the underlying tension that had been present for weeks. She was seated at her writing desk, still wearing the elegant navy suit she had chosen for her charity appearance. Her correspondence was spread before her, but Charles noticed that her pen lay unused beside the papers, suggesting that her mind had been elsewhere. "How was the literacy event?" Charles asked, settling into the familiar chair across from her desk. These moments of domestic normalcy had become precious to him, especially as the weight of kingship continued to reshape every aspect of their lives. "Wonderful, actually," Camilla replied, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The children were so eager to share their stories. There was one little girl who had written a poem about her grandmother that nearly brought me to tears. Charles watched his wife's face as she spoke, noting the way she seemed to be clinging to the positive aspects of her day. He wondered if she somehow sensed what was coming, if the intuition that had served her so well throughout their relationship was already preparing her for bad news. "Camilla," he began, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately captured her attention. "We need to discuss some developments concerning Tom and Laura." The change in her expression was immediate and profound. The warm smile faded, replaced by the guarded look of a mother preparing to defend her children. Charles had seen this transformation before, during the difficult early years of their relationship, when the press had been particularly cruel about her family. "What sort of developments?" she asked, setting down her pen with deliberate care. Charles took a deep breath, understanding that the next few minutes would fundamentally alter their relationship. "Sir Clive briefed me this morning on some security concerns that have emerged regarding their business activities. I'm afraid the situation is quite serious." He proceeded to explain everything Sir Clive had revealed, watching as Camilla's face grew increasingly pale with each detail. The business associations, the security implications, the potential for scandal. Each element of the crisis hit her like a physical blow. "Tom had no way of knowing about the backgrounds of his investors," she said finally, her voice steady despite the obvious shock. "He's built his restaurant business through hard work and talent. These connections you're describing, they're coincidental." Charles reached across the desk and took her hand. "I know that, and I believe that completely. Tom's integrity isn't in question here. But the security services are concerned about the potential for exploitation, and the palace has to consider the implications for the monarchy." Camilla pulled her hand away, standing abruptly and walking to the window that overlooked the palace gardens. The same gardens where she had walked with Charles during their courtship, where they had planned their future together, now seemed to mock the security of everything they had built. "And Laura?" she asked without turning around. "The gallery situation appears to be similar. Unwitting involvement in questionable transactions. The investigation suggests that she had no knowledge of any impropriety, but the association creates risks that the security services cannot ignore." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles could see his wife's reflection in the window glass, could observe the way her shoulders tensed as she processed the full implications of what he was telling her. When she finally turned back to face him, there was something in her expression that he had never seen before, a combination of fear and determination that spoke to the impossible position she was finding herself in. "What exactly are you telling me, Charles?" she asked, returning to her chair but maintaining a distance that felt like an ocean between them. "The recommendation from the security services is that we implement immediate distance between the crown and your family's business interests. This would mean restrictions on their access to palace events, limitations on their use of royal connections, and potentially complete separation from activities that could compromise the monarchy." The words felt like poison in his mouth. Charles watched as their impact registered on Camilla's face, saw the exact moment when she understood that he wasn't just sharing information. He was preparing to act on these recommendations. "You're talking about exiling my children from royal life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm talking about protecting the institution that we've both sworn to serve," Charles replied, though even as he spoke, he felt the inadequacy of his words. Camilla stood again, this time moving to the mantelpiece where family photographs competed for space with official royal portraits. She picked up a picture from Tom's wedding, a moment of pure family joy captured before royal duties had complicated everything. "Do you remember when we decided to marry?" she asked, still looking at the photograph. "You promised me that my family would always be welcome in your life. You understood that my children came as part of the package, that loving me meant accepting them as well." Charles felt each word like a physical blow. "I remember, and I meant every word. This isn't about my feelings for Tom and Laura. This is about circumstances beyond our control that threaten something larger than our personal relationships." "Larger than our personal relationships," Camilla repeated, setting down the photograph with exaggerated care. "That's an interesting perspective from a man who spent decades fighting to marry the woman he loved, regardless of the impact on the institution he now claims to be protecting." The accusation hung in the air between them, highlighting the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Charles's position. He had indeed fought for their relationship, had weathered years of criticism and scandal to be with Camilla, and had ultimately convinced the establishment that their marriage would strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy. "That was different," Charles said, though he could hear the weakness in his own argument. "How was it different?" Camilla challenged, turning to face him fully. How is my family's unwitting association with questionable business partners any different from our relationship during your marriage to Diana? How is this security concern any greater than the risks we posed to the monarchy during those years? Charles found himself without a ready answer. The comparison was uncomfortable because it highlighted the selective nature of the moral standards being applied. Their own relationship had survived scandals that many had thought would destroy the monarchy, yet here they were, contemplating the exile of her family over associations they hadn't even chosen. "The difference," he said finally, "is that I am now the king. The responsibilities are different, the stakes are higher, and the margin for error is smaller than it was when I was simply the heir apparent." Camilla returned to her desk, but instead of sitting, she remained standing, her hands gripping the back of her chair. "So the crown changes everything, does it? It transforms the man I married into someone who can coldly calculate the value of family relationships against institutional requirements." Charles could see that they were approaching a crossroads in their marriage, a point where the pressures of royal life might finally prove too great for even their enduring love to overcome. The realization terrified him more than any security threat or media scandal ever could. "It's not cold calculation," he said, rising from his chair and moving toward her. "It's the most difficult decision I've ever had to make. But I have responsibilities to millions of people who trust the monarchy to represent integrity and security. If I fail in those responsibilities, everything we've worked for becomes meaningless." "And what about your responsibilities to me?" Camilla asked, her voice breaking slightly. "What about your promise that we would face challenges together, that your love for me included acceptance of my family?" Charles reached out to touch her arm, but she stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. "Those responsibilities haven't changed," he said. "But they have to be balanced against other duties that I can't ignore." "Balanced," Camilla repeated bitterly, "like items on a ledger sheet. My family's inclusion in royal life weighed against the monarchy's reputation and security." The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. Camilla's private secretary entered with the evening's correspondence, immediately sensing the tension in the room and quietly withdrawing after placing the papers on a side table. The brief interruption allowed both of them to step back from the emotional precipice they had been approaching, but it also highlighted the reality of their situation. Even their most private conversations were subject to the intrusions of royal duty, their most intimate moments shaped by the demands of an institution that required constant attention. "What happens if I refuse to accept these restrictions?" Camilla asked once they were alone again. Charles felt his heart sink at the question, understanding that she was forcing him to confront the ultimate implications of his position. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never been in a situation where my duties as king and my commitments as a husband were so directly in conflict." "Well, now you are," she said simply. "And you need to decide which matters more to you, the crown or the promises you made to the woman you claim to love." The ultimatum, though not explicitly stated, was clear in her tone. Charles was being asked to choose between his role as monarch and his relationship with his wife, between the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead and the woman who had stood by him through decades of challenge and criticism. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Charles realized that he was facing a crisis that went far beyond security concerns or media management. This was a fundamental test of who he was as a man, as a husband, and as a king. The decision he made would define not just his reign but the kind of person he chose to be when faced with impossible choices. The palace corridors that had witnessed centuries of royal drama were about to become the setting for a confrontation that would challenge the very foundations of what it meant to be a modern monarch in an ancient institution. Charles had spent 74 years preparing to be king, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment when all his loyalties came into direct and irreconcilable conflict. As they stood in the elegant sitting room, surrounded by the trappings of royal privilege and the weight of institutional expectation, both Charles and Camilla understood that their marriage was about to face its greatest test. The love that had survived scandal, criticism, and decades of separation was now threatened by the very crown that had once seemed like the ultimate validation of their relationship. The evening's state dinner awaited, with its carefully choreographed protocols and diplomatic requirements. Soon, they would need to present themselves to the world as the united royal couple that the monarchy required them to be. But first, they had to decide whether that unity was still possible when duty and love pulled in opposite directions with equal force. The state dinner that evening became a masterclass in royal performance under pressure. Charles and Camilla moved through the elaborate protocols with practiced precision, greeting heads of state, sharing carefully scripted conversations, and maintaining the facade of unity that the monarchy demanded. Yet those who knew them well could detect the subtle signs of strain. The way Camilla's smile never quite reached her eyes, the slight distance Charles maintained even during their coordinated public appearances. Ambassador Richardson from the United States seemed particularly observant, his diplomatic training allowing him to sense the undercurrents of tension between the royal couple. During the formal receiving line, he made polite inquiries about the Queen Consort's family, mentioning how he had enjoyed reading Tom's latest restaurant review in the Times. Camilla's response was gracious but brief, a departure from her usual warmth when discussing her children's achievements. As the evening progressed through its elaborate courses and ceremonial toasts, Charles found his mind wandering from the diplomatic conversations to the crisis awaiting resolution in their private chambers. The French ambassador was discussing trade agreements, but Charles could only think about the impossible choice he was being forced to make between institutional duty and personal loyalty. The dinner finally concluded near midnight, with the customary farewells and diplomatic pleasantries that marked the end of such formal occasions. As the last of the guests departed, Charles and Camilla walked through the palace corridors in silence. Their formal evening were feeling like costumes from a performance that had demanded more energy than either of them possessed. "We need to finish our conversation," Camilla said as they reached the intersection where the corridors led to their respective private apartments. Charles nodded, understanding that the evening's diplomatic requirements had only postponed the resolution of their crisis. "My study," he suggested, knowing that the formal setting might help them maintain some emotional distance from what promised to be a devastating discussion. The study felt different at midnight than it had during the morning briefing. The shadows cast by the desk lamps created an intimate atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the gravity of their situation. Charles poured himself a small glass of whiskey, offering one to Camilla, who declined with a shake of her head. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, settling into the chair she had occupied that morning when their world had still seemed stable, "about responsibilities and duties and the balance between personal relationships and institutional requirements." Charles waited, sensing that she had reached some kind of decision during the long evening of diplomatic performance. "I understand the position you're in," she continued, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional cost of her words. "I understand that being king means making choices that hurt people you love in order to protect something larger than yourself." "But," Charles prompted, hearing the qualification in her tone, "but I also understand that I have my own choices to make. You're asking me to abandon my children to protect your crown. You're asking me to treat my family as acceptable casualties in your effort to maintain institutional credibility." Charles set down his glass, recognizing that they were approaching the moment of truth he had been dreading. "I'm not asking you to abandon them. I'm asking you to help me find a way to protect both the monarchy and your family." Camilla's laugh was bitter. "By exile? By cutting them off from royal life and pretending they don't exist? That's not protection, Charles. That's sacrifice. You're asking me to sacrifice my children for your crown." The accusation hit Charles like a physical blow, partly because he could hear the truth in it. The security recommendations did amount to exile, regardless of how diplomatically they were phrased. Tom and Laura would be effectively banished from royal circles, their connection to the monarchy severed to protect the institution from potential compromise. "What alternative do you see?" he asked, genuinely hoping that she might have found a solution that had escaped him and his advisors. "I see the alternative of a king who fights for his family the way he once fought for his relationship with me," Camilla replied. "I see a monarch who uses his position to protect the people he loves rather than sacrificing them to maintain his image." Charles felt the conversation shifting into territory that challenged his fundamental understanding of royal duty. "The monarchy doesn't exist to protect my personal relationships. It exists to serve the British people, and that service requires maintaining standards that are beyond reproach." "Beyond reproach," Camilla repeated, her voice carrying a note of irony. "The same monarchy that has survived Henry VIII multiple marriages, Edward VIII abdication, and our own decades-long affair is suddenly so fragile that it can't withstand my son's unwitting association with questionable business partners." The historical perspective she offered forced Charles to confront the selective nature of royal standards. The monarchy had indeed survived scandals that made the current crisis seem relatively minor, yet here he was, preparing to destroy family relationships to address what might prove to be a temporary security concern. This is different, he insisted, though his conviction was wavering. The modern world, social media, instant global communication, everything happens faster now, and the consequences are more severe. Or perhaps, Camilla suggested, the modern world simply makes it easier to use security concerns as an excuse for avoiding difficult choices. The suggestion stung because it touched on Charles's deepest fear about himself, that he might be using institutional requirements as a shield against the emotional complexity of defending his family against powerful forces within the establishment. "You think I'm taking the easy path?" he asked, genuinely incredulous. "I think you're taking the institutional path," she clarified. "The path that protects your relationship with your advisors, and the security services, and the establishment figures who want to see this problem disappear quickly and quietly." Charles found himself unable to immediately refute her characterization. The security briefings had indeed offered him a clear course of action that would resolve the immediate crisis without requiring him to challenge the very people whose support was crucial to his effectiveness as king. "And what would the non-institutional path look like?" he asked. Camilla leaned forward, her eyes brightening with the first sign of hope he had seen all day. "It would look like a king who demands a full investigation to clear his family members of any wrongdoing. It would look like a monarch who uses his influence to ensure that his son's business partners are properly vetted, and that his daughter's gallery receives the support it needs to verify the provenance of its artworks." "And if the investigation reveals genuine problems?" Charles asked. "Then we deal with those problems honestly and transparently," Camilla replied. "But we don't exile my children based on suspicions and associations. We give them the same presumption of innocence that we would want for ourselves." Charles found himself considering possibilities that hadn't been presented in the security briefings. What if, instead of distancing himself from the Parker Bowles family, he used his position to help resolve the underlying issues that had created the crisis? What if he demanded the same thorough investigation and due process that any British citizen deserved? "The security services won't like that approach," he said, thinking aloud. "The security services work for you, not the other way around," Camilla reminded him. "You're the king, Charles. You have the authority to demand that they find solutions that protect both the monarchy and innocent people who happen to be connected to it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles's nighttime security briefing, a routine protocol that had taken on new significance given the current crisis. The security officer's report was routine: no immediate threats, no unusual surveillance activity, no concerns requiring royal attention. As the security officer departed, Charles realized that the very normality of the evening's security situation highlighted the disproportion between the perceived threat posed by Camilla's family and the actual risks facing the monarchy. The real dangers to royal security came from international terrorism, foreign intelligence operations, and organized criminal activities, not from food critics with poorly vetted business partners. "I've been afraid," Charles admitted once they were alone again. "Afraid that one mistake, one scandal, one security breach could undo everything I've worked for my entire life." Camilla moved from her chair to the sofa beside his, taking his hand for the first time since their crisis had begun. "I understand that fear. But letting that fear drive you to abandon the people who love you, that's the real mistake that could undo everything." Charles looked into his wife's eyes and saw not just the woman he loved, but the partner who had helped him become the man capable of wearing the crown. She had been his strength during the difficult years, his advisor during the complex negotiations that had made their marriage possible, and his anchor during the transition to kingship. "What if we're both right?" he asked suddenly. "What if the institution does require certain standards and protections, but those requirements don't have to mean abandoning family?" "How do you mean?" Camilla asked, though he could see hope beginning to replace the despair in her expression. "What if we use this crisis as an opportunity to establish new protocols, not just for your family, but for all royal family members involved in business activities? What if we created transparency requirements, security clearances, regular reviews that would protect both the monarchy and the people connected to it?" Camilla's grip on his hand tightened. "You're talking about reform rather than exile." "I'm talking about evolution," Charles clarified. "The monarchy has always survived by adapting to new challenges rather than simply retreating from them. Maybe this is an opportunity to modernize our approach to family business activities rather than just banning them." The idea gained momentum as they discussed its possibilities. Instead of simply cutting ties with potential security risks, The palace could establish comprehensive vetting procedures for all business partnerships involving royal family members. Instead of exile based on association, they could implement transparency requirements that would actually enhance security by bringing potentially problematic connections into the open where they could be properly monitored. It would require convincing the security services to support a more complex approach, Charles acknowledged. It would require you to act like a king instead of a frightened institution manager, Camilla said, though her tone had lost its earlier edge. It would require you to lead rather than simply react to the recommendations of others. As dawn began to break over London, Charles realized that the conversation had fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to be a constitutional monarch in the modern era. The crown wasn't just a symbol to be protected through isolation and exclusion. It was a platform for leadership that could be used to solve problems rather than simply avoiding them. The crisis that had threatened to destroy his marriage had instead revealed an opportunity to establish new standards of accountability and transparency that would actually strengthen the monarchy's credibility rather than weaken it. Instead of being remembered as the king who exiled his wife's family to protect his image, he could become the monarch who modernized royal protocols to balance security with fairness. "We'll need to move carefully," he said, already beginning to formulate the approach they would take with his advisors. "The security services will need to be convinced that our alternative approach actually enhances rather than compromises their ability to protect the monarchy." "But you're willing to try?" Camilla asked, her voice carrying a note of cautious optimism. Charles squeezed her hand, feeling for the first time in days that he was making a decision based on leadership rather than fear. "I'm willing to be the king I promised to be when I took the coronation oath, someone who serves the people with wisdom and justice, not someone who abandons family at the first sign of difficulty." The morning sun streaming through the study windows seemed to symbolize a new beginning for their marriage and his reign. The crisis that had nearly torn them apart had instead become the catalyst for a more authentic approach to royal leadership, one that balanced institutional requirements with human decency. The morning following their all-night conversation brought a series of meetings that would test Charles's resolve to pursue reform rather than exile. Sir Clive Alderton arrived at the king's study precisely at 9 o'clock, accompanied by representatives from MI5 and the Metropolitan Police's Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit. The assembled group represented the institutional forces that had recommended the exile of Camilla's family, and Charles knew that convincing them to support an alternative approach would require every bit of diplomatic skill he had developed over decades of royal service. "Gentlemen," Charles began, settling behind his desk with the confidence that had taken him years to develop as king, "I've given careful consideration to yesterday's briefing and the recommendations you've presented. However, I believe we need to explore alternatives that better reflect the values of justice and proportionality that the monarchy represents." The silence that followed his opening statement was telling. Charles could see the subtle exchange of glances between his advisors, the careful recalibration of expectations that occurred when institutional recommendations met unexpected resistance from the very person they were designed to protect. Commander Sarah Williams from the Royalty Protection Unit was the first to respond. "Your Majesty, our primary concern is the security of the royal family and the integrity of the institution. The recommendations we've made are based on established protocols for managing potential security risks." "I understand those concerns completely," Charles replied, "and I share them. However, I believe we can address security risks without resorting to measures that amount to punishment for people who have committed no crimes." Sir Clive leaned forward slightly, his expression reflecting decades of experience in managing delicate royal situations. "Your Majesty, the concern isn't about punishment, but about prevention. By distancing the crown from these associations, we eliminate the possibility that they could be exploited by hostile actors." "By that logic," Charles countered, "the crown should distance itself from anyone who has any business relationships or social connections that haven't been thoroughly vetted. Such an approach would ultimately isolate the monarchy from the very people it exists to serve." The MI5 representative, a quietly competent woman named Director Patricia Hartley, spoke for the first time. "Your Majesty raises an interesting point about proportionality. Perhaps we could discuss specific measures that would address our security concerns while maintaining family relationships." Charles felt a spark of hope at her willingness to engage with alternative approaches. "That's exactly what I'm proposing. Instead of exile, we implement comprehensive vetting and monitoring protocols that would actually enhance our security intelligence about potential risks." What followed was a detailed discussion about the practicalities of reform. Commander Williams outlined how enhanced security clearance procedures could be implemented for all royal family members involved in business activities. Director Hartley explained how regular monitoring of business partnerships and financial transactions could provide early warning of potential security risks rather than simply avoiding them. The conversation revealed that the security services had indeed been taking the most conservative possible approach, recommending complete separation because it was the simplest solution from their perspective. However, when pressed to consider alternatives, they acknowledged that more sophisticated monitoring and vetting procedures could actually provide better security intelligence while maintaining family relationships. The key, Director Hartley explained, would be transparency. If Mr. Parker Bowles and Ms. Lopez were willing to subject their business activities to regular security review, and if they agreed to immediate notification protocols for any new partnerships or acquisitions, we could monitor potential risks without requiring separation from the royal family. Sir Clive nodded thoughtfully. Such an approach would also establish precedents for managing similar situations that might arise with other family members in the future. Charles recognized that they were making progress toward a solution that would address everyone's concerns. What about the immediate situation with Tom's restaurant investments and Laura's gallery? Commander Williams consulted her notes. For Mr. Parker Bowles, we would recommend immediate investigation of his existing partners, with requirements for security clearance on any future investors. For Ms. Lopez, we would need verification of provenance for the questionable artworks and implementation of enhanced due diligence procedures for future acquisitions. And if problems are discovered during these investigations? Charles asked. Then, we address them transparently and legally, Director Hartley replied. If Mr. Parker Bowles has investors with criminal connections, those partnerships can be terminated through proper legal channels. If Ms. Lopez's gallery has acquired stolen artwork, proper repatriation procedures can be implemented. Charles felt a sense of relief as the outline of a comprehensive solution began to emerge. Instead of exile based on suspicion, his stepchildren would be subject to the same kind of security protocols that applied to other senior royal family members. Instead of abandonment, they would receive support in addressing any legitimate problems that might be discovered. There's another consideration we need to address, Sir Clive said, his tone becoming more serious. The press interest in this situation is intensifying. We've managed to contain the story so far, but that won't be possible for much longer. Charles had been dreading this aspect of the crisis. Royal scandals had a way of taking on lives of their own once they reached the media, with speculation and sensationalism often overwhelming the actual facts of the situation. What's the current level of press awareness? He asked. Several papers are investigating the business connections, Commander Williams replied. They don't have the full picture yet, but they have enough information to begin asking uncomfortable questions. Charles realized that media management would be a crucial component of any solution they developed. If we're going to implement enhanced security protocols rather than exile, we need to be prepared to explain that decision publicly. Actually, Director Hartley suggested, transparency with the media could be part of our security strategy. If we proactively disclose our enhanced monitoring procedures, it makes it much more difficult for hostile actors to exploit any connections they might discover. The idea of proactive transparency was radical in the context of royal security, which traditionally relied on secrecy and distance to protect the monarchy. However, Charles could see the logic of the approach. By openly acknowledging enhanced security procedures, they would demonstrate that the royal family took security seriously without suggesting that family members were being punished for association with potential risks. We would need to coordinate carefully with the palace press office, Sir Clive noted. The messaging would need to emphasize responsibility and transparency rather than suggesting there were serious problems to begin with. As the meeting progressed, Charles found himself impressed by the willingness of his security advisors to support a more nuanced approach once they understood his determination to find alternatives to exile. The institutional bias toward conservative solutions was giving way to more creative thinking about how to balance security with fairness. I want to propose something additional, Charles said as the meeting began to wind down. I think we should establish a formal review board for all royal family business activities. Not just reactive investigation when problems arise, but proactive oversight that prevents issues from developing in the first place. The suggestion represented a significant expansion of royal protocols, but Charles could see that his advisors were beginning to embrace the concept of using the crisis as an opportunity for positive reform rather than simply damage control. Such a board could include representatives from the security services, the palace, and independent experts in finance and business law, Director Hartley suggested. It would provide ongoing oversight while also offering guidance to family members about how to structure their activities appropriately. Sir Clive was already making notes about implementation timelines and administrative requirements. We would need to brief the Queen Consort and her family about these new protocols and secure their agreement to participate in the enhanced oversight procedures. Charles felt a moment of anxiety about Camilla's reaction to the security oversight that would now become a permanent feature of her children's lives. However, he believed that she would accept enhanced monitoring in exchange for continued inclusion in royal life. "I'll handle the family briefings personally," Charles said. "They need to understand both the seriousness of the situation and our commitment to finding solutions that protect everyone involved." As his advisors departed to begin implementing the new protocols, Charles remained in his study, reflecting on how the crisis had evolved. 24 hours earlier, he had been preparing to exile Camilla's family to protect his reign. Now, he was implementing comprehensive reforms that would actually strengthen royal security while preserving family relationships. The afternoon was spent in detailed planning sessions with various palace departments. The press office developed messaging strategies for proactive disclosure of the enhanced security protocols. The legal department reviewed the constitutional implications of expanded oversight procedures. The administrative staff began organizing the logistics of establishing the new review board. Each meeting reinforced Charles's growing confidence that they were pursuing the right approach. Instead of reacting to a crisis with fear and exclusion, they were responding with leadership and innovation. The monarchy was evolving to meet modern challenges rather than simply retreating from them. As evening approached, Charles prepared for the most important conversation of the day, explaining the new approach to Camilla and securing her family's cooperation with the enhanced security protocols. The success of everything they had planned would depend on Tom and Laura's willingness to accept unprecedented oversight of their business activities in exchange for continued inclusion in royal life. The private dinner that evening would be crucial in determining whether the alternative to exile could actually work in practice. Charles had chosen to invite Tom and Laura to join him and Camilla for an informal family meal, understanding that the personal touch would be essential in securing their cooperation with the new security requirements. As he prepared for what might be the most important family dinner of his reign, Charles reflected on how crisis had become an opportunity for authentic leadership. The king who had been prepared to abandon family to protect his image was being replaced by a monarch willing to use his position to find solutions that honored both security and human relationships. The evening would test whether his reformed approach could work in practice, whether the balance between institutional requirements and family loyalty could be maintained through enhanced transparency rather than painful separation. The future of his marriage, his reign, and his understanding of what it meant to be a modern constitutional monarch hung in the balance of the conversation that was about to unfold. The private dining room in the palace had hosted countless family gatherings over the decades, but none had carried the weight of the dinner Charles had arranged for this evening. As he and Camilla prepared to meet with Tom and Laura Parker Bowles, Charles understood that the next few hours would determine not just the future of their family relationships, but the kind of monarch he would prove to be when faced with his first major crisis. Tom arrived first, his usual easy confidence tempered by the awareness that something significant was troubling his stepfather. At 49, Tom had built a successful career as a food critic and restaurant owner, navigating the complex world of London's culinary scene with skill and integrity. However, the past few weeks had brought an uncomfortable awareness that his connection to the royal family made every business decision subject to scrutiny he had never anticipated. Laura followed shortly after, her artist sensitivity allowing her to immediately perceive the tension in the room. At 46, she had always maintained a lower profile than her brother, focusing on her art gallery and her family while supporting the royal family's charitable activities when requested. The elegant woman who entered the dining room carried herself with the same grace that had helped her navigate decades of public attention as the daughter of the future queen consort. "Thank you both for joining us on such short notice," Charles began as they settled around the intimate table that had been set for four rather than the formal arrangements usually required for royal dinners. "I know this is unusual, but we have some family matters that need to be discussed honestly." Camilla reached across the table to touch Laura's hand, a gesture that spoke to her protective instincts as a mother. Your stepfather has some information to share about security concerns that have arisen regarding your business activities. Charles proceeded to explain the situation with a directness that surprised everyone at the table. Rather than the diplomatic language typically employed in royal communications, he spoke plainly about the security investigations, the potential risks that had been identified, and the recommendations that had initially called for complete separation between the Crown and the Parker Bowles family business interests. The security services believed that the safest approach would be to distance you both from royal life entirely, Charles explained, watching as his stepchildren absorbed the gravity of what he was telling them. Yesterday, I was prepared to implement those recommendations. The silence that followed was profound. Tom set down his wine glass with careful precision, while Laura's face reflected the shock of learning how close they had come to exile from the family that had become central to their lives over the past 2 decades. What changed your mind? Tom asked finally, his voice steady despite the obvious impact of what he had just learned. Charles looked at Camilla before responding, understanding that his answer would reflect not just his decision-making process, but his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be both a king and a family man. Your mother helped me understand that abandoning family to protect institutional interests isn't leadership. It's cowardice disguised as duty, he replied. Real leadership means finding solutions that protect both security and human relationships. Laura leaned forward, her artist's eye noting the subtle changes in her mother's expression that spoke to the private struggle the couple had endured over the past 2 days. What kind of solutions? Charles outlined the alternative approach they had developed: enhanced security protocols, regular monitoring of business activities, transparency requirements, and the establishment of a formal review board for all royal family business interests. As he spoke, he could see his stepchildren weighing the implications of accepting unprecedented oversight in exchange for continued inclusion in royal life. You're talking about living under constant surveillance, Tom observed, though his tone was more curious than resistant. We're talking about living with the same kind of security awareness that applies to all senior royal family members, Charles clarified. The monitoring isn't punitive, it's protective. It allows us to identify potential problems before they become security risks or public scandals. Laura asked the question that Charles had been anticipating. And if you discover that there are genuine problems with our business activities? Then, we address them honestly and transparently, Camilla replied before Charles could answer. We don't exile family members for making innocent mistakes or being targeted by people with questionable motives. The dinner proceeded with a detailed discussion of the practical implications of the new security protocols. Tom would need to submit his existing restaurant partnerships for security review and agree to clearance procedures for future investors. Laura would need to verify the provenance of her gallery's recent acquisitions and implement enhanced due diligence procedures for future purchases. I have to ask, Laura said as the main course was served, are you confident that these measures will actually satisfy the security services? Or are we just postponing the inevitable? Charles appreciated her directness. The security professionals I've spoken with are supportive of this approach. They believe that enhanced monitoring and transparency will actually provide better security intelligence than simple avoidance of potential risks. There's something else, Camilla added, her voice carrying a note of pride that hadn't been present during their previous conversations about the crisis. Your stepfather is using this situation to establish new protocols that will protect all royal family members involved in business activities. You're not just accepting oversight. You're helping to create a system that will benefit others in similar situations. Tom smiled for the first time during the evening. So we're guinea pigs for royal reform? You're partners in evolution, Charles replied, using the phrase that had emerged during his discussions with security advisors. The monarchy has always survived by adapting to new challenges rather than simply retreating from them. As the evening progressed, both Tom and Laura began to see the enhanced security protocols not as punishment for unwitting associations, but as protection against future problems and a demonstration of the royal family's commitment to accountability and transparency. I appreciate that you're willing to fight for us, Laura said as dessert was served. It would have been easier to simply cut us loose and avoid the complications. Easier, perhaps, Charles replied, but not right. Family loyalty isn't conditional on convenience. The conversation turned to practical implementation details. The security review of Tom's business partnerships would begin immediately, with support from palace lawyers to ensure that any necessary changes were handled properly. Laura's gallery would receive assistance from art authentication experts to verify the provenance of questionable pieces and establish procedures to prevent similar issues in the future. What about the press? Tom asked, raising the concern that had been weighing on everyone's minds. Charles had given considerable thought to media strategy. We're going to be proactive with disclosure. Rather than waiting for journalists to uncover information piecemeal, we're going to announce the establishment of enhanced security protocols for royal family business activities. You're going to tell them that you investigated us? Laura asked with concern. We're going to tell them that we take security seriously and have implemented comprehensive procedures to ensure that all family business activities meet the highest standards, Camilla clarified. The focus will be on responsible oversight rather than past problems. As the dinner concluded, Charles felt a sense of relief that had been absent for days. His stepchildren had not only agreed to cooperate with the enhanced security protocols, but had embraced the opportunity to help establish precedents that would benefit the entire royal family. There's one more thing, he said as they prepared to leave. I want you both to know that this experience has taught me something important about what it means to be king. Leadership isn't about avoiding problems. It's about solving them in ways that reflect the values you want to represent. The weeks that followed tested the effectiveness of the new approach. The security review of Tom's restaurant partnerships revealed that several of his investors did indeed have questionable backgrounds, but the enhanced oversight procedures allowed these associations to be terminated through proper legal channels rather than creating a public scandal. Laura's gallery investigation discovered that 2 of the recently acquired artworks had been stolen from private collections decades earlier. However, the proactive approach to authentication allowed for quiet repatriation to the rightful owners, turning a potential scandal into a demonstration of ethical business practices. The establishment of the Royal Family Business Review Board received positive press coverage, with commentators praising the monarchy's commitment to accountability and transparency. Rather than appearing defensive about family associations, the palace was seen as taking responsible steps to prevent problems before they could develop. More importantly, the crisis that had nearly destroyed Charles's marriage instead strengthened it by demonstrating his willingness to fight for family rather than simply protecting institutional interests. Camilla's respect for her husband deepened as she watched him choose the more difficult path of reform over the easier option of exile. The security services discovered that the enhanced monitoring procedures provided superior intelligence about potential threats compared to their previous approach of simply avoiding associations with questionable individuals. The transparency requirements made it much more difficult for hostile actors to exploit family connections because those connections were already subject to ongoing scrutiny. 6 months after the crisis began, Charles reflected on how it had fundamentally changed his understanding of constitutional monarchy. The crown wasn't just a symbol to be protected through isolation and exclusion. It was a platform for leadership that could be used to solve problems rather than simply avoiding them. The king who had been prepared to exile his wife's family to protect his image had been replaced by a monarch who used his position to establish new standards of accountability that actually strengthened the institution he served. The palace that had initially been left speechless by the crisis had become the center of innovative approaches to balancing security with human relationships. As Charles and Camilla walked through the palace gardens one evening, discussing their plans for the upcoming state visit, both understood that their marriage had survived its greatest test. The love that had endured scandal, criticism, and decades of separation had proven strong enough to withstand the pressures of kingship itself. Do you ever regret choosing the more difficult path? Camilla asked as they paused beside the rose garden that had been one of their favorite retreating spots during their courtship. Never, Charles replied, taking her hand as they watched the sunset paint the palace walls in shades of gold. The crown is only as strong as the character of the person who wears it. I'd rather be remembered as a king who fought for his family than one who abandoned them when it became inconvenient. The crisis that had threatened to leave the palace speechless had instead given King Charles III his voice as a leader who understood that true strength came not from avoiding difficult choices, but from making them with wisdom, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the values that made the monarchy worth preserving. In the years that followed, the precedents established during the Parker Bowles crisis would guide the royal family through numerous challenges, demonstrating that evolution and adaptation were not signs of institutional weakness, but evidence of a monarchy confident enough in its fundamental purpose to embrace change when change served justice and human dignity. The story that began with security concerns and exile recommendations had become a testament to the possibility of leadership that honored both duty and love, proving that even ancient institutions could find new ways to balance competing loyalties when guided by wisdom rather than fear.